Who would have thought that back in 2007, when Pep Guardiola was named the manager of the Barcelona B team, he would later go on to be one of, if not the greatest manager of his generation? Ladies and gentlemen, join me as we take a look back at the greatest team ever in the history of the game, Barcelona. In the 2007-2008 season, Barcelona under Juan Laporta announced that Frank Rijkaard would be leaving the football club and Pep Guardiola would be appointed the new manager heading into that 08-09 season. Now, the thing is, when Barcelona then decided to appoint Pep Guardiola, little was really known about Pep Guardiola in the managerial world. Of course, they knew about him from being a player and things like that. But in terms of in the managerial side of things, he was still a rookie. He was managing, that Barcelona B team, helped them to get promoted. And I feel like, back then it wasn't so much about the star names and things like that in terms of managers. It was more for Barcelona about the philosophy. It was more about, this is a manager who understands the DNA of Barcelona. This is a manager, who's worked under the Johan Cruyffs and understands that way of learning and playing the correct, should we say, way for Barcelona. And listen, when Pep Guardiola came in, he was making a lot of noise. He was a rookie, but he did come in, making noise and, mentioning, that players like Ronaldinho, Deco, Samuel Eto'o, those players wouldn't be a part of his plans, for the upcoming seasons. And these were players that he felt needed to leave the football club because under the old regime with Frank Rijkaard, of course, in charge, he just felt like these type of players would be a negative influence on what he was trying to do moving forward and the direction he was trying to take the football club in. It's so crazy when you think about it because every manager believes in their own hype. Every manager believes that they are the best manager or they could be the best manager, as long as the team, the club, the players all kind of buy into their principle, right? And listen, ultimately we know what happened with Pep Guardiola in terms of how it all ended, for him at Barcelona, trophy laden career over there at Barcelona, created probably the biggest and best dynasty that we've probably ever seen in this modern era of football, in terms of a team who completely dominated football to the point that now we have football teams, managers who want to play that similar style of football and miss those old days. You guys just look at this squad. This isn't the 08-09 season. Look at the players they had. Of course, listen, he did want to let go, of course, like players of Henry and the Eto'os, the Ronaldinhos, and people of that kind of ilk, the Dzekos, and he wanted to bed in, players that he felt would be more akin to what he was trying to do, as I mentioned before. So, players like Yaya Toure, coming in, buying a player like Dani Alves, these kind of little things. But of course, he had to also remember that too much change too quickly is always going to be quite detrimental to a team, and it doesn't allow for any real continuity. And of course, these are still top players that we're talking about, at the time. Thierry Henry just coming from Arsenal, Samuel Eto'o, who was obviously a brilliant player for Barcelona, and then of course moving on to Inter Milan. Yaya Toure was someone who was still quite young and still quite learning his game, but he was still quite a very decent player for Barcelona. PK obviously coming back from Manchester United, Abidal, what more can we say about him? Dani Alves, of course, being at Sevilla. All of these players were still decent enough, and the fact that he ended that season, and getting himself 6, trophies, come the end of that 08 kind of 09, type of season, especially heading into the 2010, and it's just incredible when we think about it, like the impact I feel that this kind of team left upon everybody. I felt like it's quite everlasting, and it's like the beginning of something. We still had to go through, the next era of players and the next kind of era of a team that Pep Guardiola, was going to show us. Now, listen, I'm biased, so of course, when I watch Barcelona, or when I just watch football in a general sense, you guys can see throughout the years the type of football that Barcelona, used to play under Pep Guardiola. It is the best football that I have ever seen. And again, like I mentioned before about, managers, especially the younger managers, who are copying this kind of style, managers who watched Pep Guardiola throughout his years, understood that in this kind of style of football, it wasn't just necessarily always going to be about, Lionel Messi, as brilliant as he is and probably the greatest player to ever play the game. It was about the team. He made others want to have players like a Xavi, like an Iniesta, like a Pedri or a Pedro, should I say, or a Iniesta, a Busquets. He made these kind of players a lot more popular. People started looking at their midfield and wondering, why have they got these, diminutive, type of midfielders who are not necessarily combative, but for some weird reason, these guys are absolutely dominating us. And, they're coming up against the Germans, the Italians, the English, big, strong, physical individuals, and who also, by the way, have fantastic players, within their own teams. And he's just making them look quite average at times. And all they're really doing is, as you guys can see, it's just pass and move. And again, it's what's been embedded in that Barcelona DNA. And it's been embedded for so long. And I feel like Pep Guardiola coming in just reinforced that. Having that manager who managed the B team, who knew of a couple of the players already, promoted a couple of those players, allowed for those players to kind of imprint their DNA as well into the actual squad, which then means players who then come into the team then understand that this is the style. This is the way that we need to play. And like I said, it helps when you've got Lionel Messi, in your team. But when you've got these smart players as well, honestly, it was just an absolute joy to watch. And they absolutely terrorized, football for about 3 to 4 years, if I'm being totally honest with you. It was just so, I think it was mostly because we'd seen teams dominate. We've seen Manchester United, Chelsea have had a little stint as well. Real Madrid are obviously Real Madrid, and Barca have also won trophies themselves prior to Pep Guardiola coming in. But I think it was the way that he was doing it, and he was doing it with a distinct style of play, something that I don't really feel that I'd really seen growing up in a generation, is that there's this style of play that not only is he playing at club level, they've also had to incorporate this into international level for the Spanish team, purely because we've reached a stage where they've got too many of the same players. So we're going to have to, play the same kind of football in order to get results, which of course led to, Spain winning all of those trophies that they did in a short space of time. And it was just so distinct, but people understood as well. I think, and again, probably one of the main reasons as to why a lot of these managers seem to want to copy is because they saw the benefits of a system like this. So everybody tries to replicate it. Unfortunately, there's only one Xavi, there's only one Iniesta, and there's only one Sergio Busquets. There is nobody who is going to be like Messi ever in the history of the game whilst he was there. One thing I also want to give Pep Guardiola credit for, and I don't actually feel that people give him enough credit, and I do think it is a bit of a balancing act, and I can totally understand as to why people may see it a bit differently, is that I don't think people give Guardiola the credit for what he actually did for Lionel Messi in terms of the type of player he then inevitably, of course, turned into. Listen, Messi prior to Pep Guardiola coming in was someone I would have considered, listen, a joy to watch for me, of course, but I didn't feel that Messi had what he ended up being in the end. I didn't feel that he was going to do that under Frank Rijkaard. I always looked at him and just felt that this was always going to be a top player regardless. But I didn't really feel that he would be able to hit the heights that he did until Pep Guardiola came in. And by the way, I didn't know that Pep Guardiola was going to come in and do what he did for Lionel Messi. But what he ended up doing, in terms of the positions, the instructions, the role, the license, the freedom, the kind of, the free reign that he gave Lionel Messi, making sure that he himself was in the right positions, making sure that the team was playing in a specific way, which would of course enable Lionel Messi to be able to do what he did. I felt like people don't give him enough credit. Of course, Messi is Messi at the end of the day. Messi should get the plaudits, and rightly so, he should get the majority of the plaudits. But I don't think Messi becomes the player that he does without, Pep Guardiola, and I don't think Pep Guardiola becomes the manager that he does without Lionel Messi. Hence the reason why I feel the two work so well. again, I also have to give him the credit, Ronaldinho, the greatest player on planet Earth until Lionel Messi, decided to, pop up at Barcelona. But, the fact that, players like Ronaldinho, the Samuel Eto'o, the Thierry Henry's, the fact that he kind of looked at those players, the Dzekos as well, and said, you know what, I could do without you kind of guys here. Brilliant players as you are, these are some of the best, as I mentioned, Ronaldinho, obviously best player in the world, and Eto'o and Thierry are not too far behind. Dzeko, one of the best midfielders, in the world during this kind of period. The fact that he looked at these players and said, yeah, you know what, I don't really need you guys. I don't really need you guys to stay at the football club, because the reality is I've got other players who can come through, and they're going to be the players that I need to be able to implement the plan that I've got, for the team and again for the club. And it's just bravery. And again, listen, that could have all backfired. It really could have backfired. And when Ronaldinho and Messi were on the same pitch together, and they were doing their thing, and you thought, oh my goodness, this could turn out to be the king, announcing, the prince, kind of thing. And it was that whole kind of vibe, in and around the two players. And then Pep Guardiola comes in and just kind of says, yep, you know what, I think the prince is ready. I do think we need to knock down the king. And you just, I think that would, again, that in itself was such a shock. But again, he has to get the plaudits for that. He has to, because if he doesn't do that, Lionel Messi isn't able to thrive in the way that he does, and the team is not able to progress in the way that it does. And listen, look, with the amount of trophies that his team's kind of won, I think he was justified in the in the decisions that he made throughout his tenure at Barcelona. But listen, also come the end of his tenure, it didn't really look too good for him. People were criticizing him in his last season, and I feel that he kind of felt the pressure, from Barcelona, from the expectations of what, he had been able to achieve, the amount of trophies, that the team, had inevitably won throughout this time, the football that they were playing, everything was Barcelona, Barcelona, Barcelona. Heck, this is probably the reason why he had to go bald. But it is just one of those things, and hence the reason why he decided to, of course, take that sabbatical after his time at Barcelona, because he probably just felt, I've never had this intensity, I've never had this level of pressure put on and placed upon me, throughout my time, just maybe even more so than he was when he was a player for Barcelona under Johan Cruyff. So, these kind of things can always take a toll. But listen, Barcelona, Pep Guardiola, the players, they brought us so much joy, over those few years, with just their style of play, the smiles on their faces, what they were doing to football, at that period of time. It was absolutely brilliant to watch. And I don't believe we will, not for a very long time anyway, we will see a team who can dominate football like that with such a distinct style of play. I just don't believe that we will be able to ever really see that. And I do think it's going to take probably about 100 years before we ever really see that kind of thing again, depending of course on how football kind of continues and develops and changes throughout the years. But I just can't think of a team who looks like they're even close or remotely close to potentially emulating that. And I just think that is why this Barcelona team, the squad, throughout these few years was just the greatest. This was just the best, greatest team that we have ever seen in the history of the sport. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section. People, do you guys believe that this is the greatest football team that you have ever seen in your life? Let me know your thoughts, man. Catch you guys in a bit. Peace.